The judge sided with the racist cops. That was the moment the humiliation reached its peak. The courtroom was silent, yet it was a silence soaked in injustice, a silence that screamed louder than any voice ever could. She stood there, not as a criminal, because she wasn't, but as a victim of a system designed to break people like her. A black woman, alone, in a place where the law wasn't meant to protect her, only to punish. The officers stood on the other side of the room, arms folded, smug smiles stretching across their faces. They had won. They knew it, she knew it, and worst of all, the judge knew it too. He wasn't even pretending to be neutral. His disinterest in her case was blatant, almost as if it was routine for him to discard evidence when it came from the hands of a black defendant. Her lawyer had presented everything, footage proving the officers planted drugs in her car, witnesses confirming she had done nothing wrong, a spotless record that should have made the entire case collapse on itself. But it didn't. Because it was never about justice. It was about power. And in this room, the ones with power looked nothing like her. The judge barely glanced at the evidence before shoving it aside, tapping his fingers against the bench like this was a waste of his time. The officers' testimonies are clear. The defendant was resisting arrest and found in possession of illegal substances. The charges will not be dismissed, he said, his voice sharp and final. Her lawyer slammed his hands on the table. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The footage clearly, enough, the judge interrupted, finally looking at her, but not with the gaze of someone seeing a human being, just a case number, a problem to be discarded. This is my courtroom, and I won't have anyone questioning my decision. He turned to the officers. Your work is appreciated. Keep keeping our streets safe. The cops grinned, exchanging glances as if this was just another day for them, another black person thrown into the system, another win. One of them walked past her as they exited the witness stand, leaning in just enough for her to hear him. Should have known better, sweetheart. This ain't your country. The other chuckled under his breath. Yeah, should have stayed in her lane. Their laughter echoed as they stepped back, proud of what they had done. They weren't just officers. They were hunters, and she was supposed to be their prey. Except they had no idea. No idea who she really was. She clenched her fists, her entire body trembling, not from fear, not from helplessness, but from the rage bubbling beneath her skin. She had been silent long enough. They thought they had the final word. They didn't. Slowly, she reached into her pocket, her fingers grazing the one thing that would change the entire trajectory of that room. The badge. A slow, bitter smile stretched across her lips as she took a step forward. You're right, she said, her voice dangerously calm. The room barely noticed her speaking, until her next words made the air grow thick. I should have stayed in my lane. The officers turned, confused for a second, but that second was all she needed. With one smooth motion, she pulled out her badge and raised it high. Silence. Real silence. Not the kind of silence that dismissed injustice, but the kind that preceded an execution. She saw it, the shift in their faces. The smug confidence dissolving into pure, unfiltered panic. The realization of who they had just crossed. The horror that they had spent the last few minutes humiliating the wrong person. Under federal law, she continued, her voice sharp enough to cut through their arrogance, I hereby place you all under arrest. The judge's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His face drained of color as he leaned forward, eyes darting between her badge and her now fearless expression. The officers took a step back, visibly shaken, like their entire world had just flipped upside down. Then, she delivered the words that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. I am the Chief of Police of the United States. The entire courtroom exploded. Gasps. Screams. Lawyers turned to one another in shock. The jury, the audience, even the reporters scribbling on their notepads, everyone was frozen in disbelief. The officers stood there, motionless, their minds scrambling to process what had just happened. The same woman they had mocked, the same woman they had tried to throw behind bars, was the most powerful law enforcement officer in the entire country. And now, it was their turn to be judged. The judge stammered, for the first time in his life at a loss for words. His hands gripped the gavel, knuckles white, as he tried to maintain control of a courtroom that was slipping from his grasp. He had no power anymore. Not here. Not in front of her. The officers? They weren't laughing anymore. The same arrogance they carried moments ago had shattered into desperation. They weren't predators anymore. They were prey. And she was about to unleash the full force of justice upon them. But what would happen next, how far this vengeance would go, how deep their corruption ran, and just how much power she truly held, would leave the entire nation in shock. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to say something important. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. We believe in justice, equality, and the power of storytelling to expose injustice and inspire change. If you've ever faced discrimination, know that you are seen, you are valued, and you are not alone. This story isn't just a story, it's a reflection of real struggles and a reminder that truth and justice always find a way. Now, sit back and enjoy the ride. And if you support powerful stories like this, hit that subscribe button and join us for more. Let's get started. The courthouse towered over the city like a monument carved from arrogance and power, its cold marble walls reflecting the sun's glare, a reminder that justice here was not blind, it was calculated, deliberate, and selectively enforced. Inside, the air was thick with an unspoken truth, a silent agreement among those who walked its halls: some people mattered, and some people didn't. This was not a place where fairness was guaranteed, nor a place where the law applied equally to all. It was a battlefield disguised as a courtroom, where outcomes were determined long before the first gavel ever struck. And at the center of that battlefield stood Janelle Carter, a woman who had spent years fighting against this system, only to find herself now at its mercy, shackled at the wrists like a common criminal, her dignity stripped away by men who knew exactly what they were doing. The moment the cold metal cuffs had clamped around her wrists, she had felt it, not fear, but rage. A deep, unrelenting fire burning in the pit of her stomach, a fire she had learned to control but never extinguish. She had been in courtrooms like this before, had stood on the other side of the bench, had witnessed firsthand how the wheels of justice turned differently for those with power and those without. But today, it was different. Today, she was the one forced into the defendant's chair, her name spoken with contempt, her character torn apart by a prosecutor who didn't care about truth, only about winning. Across from her, Judge Richard Calloway sat in his high-backed leather chair, the embodiment of judicial corruption, his presence so heavy it pressed down on the room like an iron weight. His reputation preceded him, a man whose rulings had ruined lives, a man who played God in a courtroom where his word was law. He was the kind of judge who wore his bias like a badge of honor, who barely concealed his disdain for people like her, who had long since abandoned the pretense of fairness. He had seen the evidence, footage that proved her innocence, witnesses who could testify to the truth, documentation that should have dismantled the case in seconds, and yet, none of it mattered. He wasn't interested in facts. He wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in preserving the power structure that had kept men like him in control for generations. The officers who had arrested her stood nearby, their uniforms crisp, their badges polished, their faces blank masks of indifference. But Janelle could see beyond their practiced expressions, could read the silent triumph in their posture, in the way their eyes gleamed with something sinister. Officer Daniel Hayes, the architect of this entire charade, was the worst of them, his smug confidence radiating from him like a stench. He had orchestrated it all, the false charges, the planted evidence, the narrative carefully constructed to ensure her downfall. Beside him stood Officer Brian Turner, younger but no less corrupt, a man who followed orders without question, eager to prove himself in a system that rewarded cruelty. And then there was Officer Sean Gallagher, the quiet one, the one who never spoke unless spoken to, the one who pretended he wasn't just as complicit. He wasn't a leader like Hayes, nor a lackey like Turner. He was something far worse, a man who knew what they were doing was wrong, and did it anyway. They had done this before. Janelle could feel it in the ease of their movements, in the way they leaned back as if this was all routine. How many innocent lives had they destroyed? How many black men and women had sat in this very seat, falsely accused, railroaded by a system that had already decided their fate before they even stepped foot in the courtroom? The thought made her blood boil, made her grip the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. The prosecutor's voice droned on, listing the fabricated charges with the kind of practiced ease that only came from years of perfecting the art of deception. Possession with intent to distribute. Resisting arrest. Assaulting an officer. The words rang out, cold and final, as if spoken into existence made them real. The weight of the accusations pressed down on Janelle's shoulders, but she refused to bow beneath it. She knew the truth. And the truth was, this wasn't about a crime. It was about silencing her. It was about removing her from the equation before she could expose them for what they really were. Her lawyer, Marcus Ellington, was one of the few left who still believed in justice, but even he looked weary, his frustration barely concealed as he fought against an enemy that had already won. He had presented everything, video evidence that showed the drugs being planted, eyewitness testimony confirming her innocence, a spotless record that should have made the case collapse under its own lies. But Judge Calloway didn't care. He waved it all away with the dismissive flick of his wrist, barely bothering to hide his contempt. "The footage is inadmissible," he said, his voice dry, as if the words bored him. "The witness statements lack credibility. The evidence stands as presented." Janelle's breath hitched. Unbelievable. Marcus slammed his hands against the table. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a clear miscarriage of justice. The prosecution's case is built on fabricated evidence." "Enough," Calloway interrupted, his patience as thin as his moral compass. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Ellington, and I won't have anyone questioning my decisions." His gaze flickered toward the officers, and then, in a voice dripping with condescension, he added, "I appreciate the hard work of our law enforcement officers. They risk their lives every day to keep us safe. And in my court, their word carries weight." Janelle's stomach twisted. It was a performance. A grotesque, calculated show of authority, of power being wielded for no other reason than because it could be. Hayes smirked. "Guess it's just not your lucky day." Turner chuckled. "Maybe next time, don't run your mouth so much." Gallagher said nothing. He never did. The verdict hadn't even been spoken yet, but everyone in the room already knew what it would be. Guilty. Because that's what always happened. Because in this place, innocence didn't matter. Because power didn't bend for truth, it crushed it. Calloway cleared his throat, preparing to seal her fate. And that was when Janelle stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Marcus whispered her name, a warning in his tone, but she wasn't listening. Not anymore. She had played their game. She had let them believe they had won. Now, it was her turn. Every eye in the room was on her. The weight of history, of expectation, of injustice centuries in the making bore down on her shoulders. But she wasn't afraid. She reached into her pocket. And the world shifted. The moment Janelle pulled the badge from her pocket, time seemed to stretch, bending under the weight of disbelief. The heavy silence that had filled the courtroom just seconds before now cracked, giving way to whispers that crawled through the air like static before an inevitable explosion. Her fingers curled around the metal, polished and gleaming under the fluorescent lights, a symbol of true authority, one that overpowered the fake sense of control the men before her thought they had. Judge Calloway's expression shifted first, his smug confidence faltering just enough for the first trace of fear to slip through. He blinked once, as if his mind was struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. His fingers tensed against the polished wood of his bench, and for the first time since the trial began, he did not speak. His silence was telling. It was the kind of silence that came when a man realized he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Hayes took a step forward, his cocky smirk evaporating into something closer to alarm. He glanced at Turner and Gallagher, looking for reassurance, but neither of them had answers for him. The air had shifted too suddenly, the power dynamic reversed in a way that no one in that room had been prepared for. Janelle inhaled slowly, steadying the fire burning beneath her ribs, before speaking in a voice so measured, so lethal in its calmness, that it cut through the tension like a blade. Under federal law, I hereby place you all under arrest. A collective gasp rippled through the spectators, sharp and disbelieving, as though the very fabric of reality had torn before their eyes. The sound of chairs creaking as people leaned forward, of pens scratching hastily against notepads, of cameras shifting to capture the impossible, it all blended into the chaos that was about to unfold. The judge exhaled sharply, his voice uneven for the first time, a stark contrast to the unshakable arrogance he had wielded so easily before. This is outrageous. You have no authority in my courtroom. Janelle's gaze locked onto his, unyielding. Your courtroom? She took a step forward, the badge still held high, a symbol of a power far greater than his gavel could ever wield. You think this is your courtroom? That you can twist the law to protect men like them, to silence people like me? That you can discard evidence, ignore the truth, and no one will ever hold you accountable? Her voice cut through the room, resonating off the marble walls, pressing down on every person seated there. You've ruled over this court like a king, deciding who walks free and who gets buried under false charges, all while pretending the law is on your side. But today, Judge Calloway, the law belongs to me. Hayes' breath hitched, and for the first time, true panic flickered in his gaze. This is some kind of joke, he spat, trying to regain control, his voice breaking at the edges. You're bluffing. Janelle didn't blink. Am I? She reached into her pocket again, this time pulling out a folded document, the kind that would tear their world apart in seconds. She unfolded it with the same deliberate slowness that had every officer in the room stiffening, their hands twitching toward their belts, their instincts screaming that something was very, very wrong. Gallagher finally spoke, his voice hoarse. What the hell is that? Janelle let the paper unfold completely before turning it in their direction, allowing them to see the bold signature, the official insignia, the stamp of finality that sealed their fate. This is a federal warrant, she said, her voice still calm, still in control, as if this had always been the inevitable outcome. Signed and authorized at the highest level. You, Officer Hayes, Officer Turner, and Officer Gallagher, are officially under investigation for misconduct, falsifying evidence, illegal arrests, and racial profiling under federal law. The words hit like a hammer against stone, fracturing the illusion that had allowed them to act without consequences for years. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled to capture every word, some already whispering into their microphones, knowing that this story would dominate every news outlet within the hour. Turner paled, his voice cracking. This is bullshit. You think you can just waltz in here and, I don't think, Janelle interrupted, cutting through his denial with razor-sharp finality. I know. And so do the people watching this unfold. Do you hear that? She gestured toward the courtroom doors, where murmurs from outside had grown into a rising wave of voices, people demanding justice, demanding accountability. You don't own this city anymore. You don't control this narrative. It's over. Hayes shook his head, his eyes darting wildly between his fellow officers, searching for some way out, some last shred of leverage. You think this changes anything? He let out a humorless laugh, but it lacked the confidence he had once carried so easily. I've been in this game for years, sweetheart. Cops like me don't go down that easy. Janelle smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent an icy chill down his spine. You're right, she admitted, tilting her head slightly. Cops like you never go down easy. She took another step forward, her presence towering, unshakable. But you do go down. The doors burst open. And what happened next would leave the entire nation in shock. The doors burst open, and what followed was nothing short of chaos unleashed. The echo of heavy boots against the marble floors reverberated through the courtroom, a sound that sent a sharp, paralyzing jolt through the men who had, just moments ago, believed themselves untouchable. Federal agents swarmed inside, their presence a force of reckoning that shattered the illusion of control Judge Calloway and his officers had clung to so desperately. The sound of weapons unholstering, the sharp, authoritative commands slicing through the stunned silence, it was the sound of power shifting. Judge Calloway's face contorted into something almost inhuman, a grotesque fusion of rage and fear, as if his body couldn't decide whether to fight or flee. His hands, once so firm and commanding, now trembled against the polished surface of his bench. He opened his mouth, gasping, choking on his own disbelief, before managing to force words past his lips, though they carried none of the authority they once did. This is an abuse of power. You have no right. Janelle barely looked at him. His words meant nothing. Instead, her attention remained locked onto the three officers who had orchestrated her downfall, the men who had spent years preying on those they considered beneath them, who had laughed in the face of justice and never expected it to come knocking on their own door. Hayes stood stiff, jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. Turner's cocky bravado had collapsed entirely, his face paling as he shifted his weight like a cornered animal. But it was Gallagher, quiet, passive Gallagher, who looked the worst of them all. His entire body tensed, like he was finally seeing himself for what he really was. A voice cut through the tension, sharp and unrelenting. Daniel Hayes. Brian Turner. Sean Gallagher. The agent leading the operation stepped forward, his presence cold and professional, the weight of the full force of the law behind every syllable of their names. You are under arrest for falsifying evidence, obstruction of justice, unlawful arrests, and numerous counts of misconduct. You have the right to remain silent. Hayes snapped. This is bullshit. His voice cracked under the strain, the sheer desperation behind it making his rage sound hollow. He turned to Calloway, his last remaining hope. Judge, do something. You can stop this, tell them. But Calloway was frozen, his own mind unraveling beneath the reality unfolding before him. His lifetime of unchecked power was slipping away, crumbling beneath the weight of a system that had finally come for him. His lips parted, but no sound came. Hayes panicked. He whirled back to Janelle, eyes burning with something uglier than fear, something animalistic and desperate. You think you're some kind of hero? His voice, once so drenched in arrogance, was breaking apart at the seams. You think this changes anything? You think, Janelle didn't flinch. Didn't blink. She had waited for this moment. She had suffered for this moment. And now, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Hayes's voice snapped like a live wire, his composure unraveling faster than he could catch it. You are nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. A black woman who thinks, enough. The word was calm. Deadly. Final. The courtroom shifted. Janelle stepped forward, her presence commanding, her every movement a declaration of power. You talk about me like I don't belong here, she said, her voice low but unshakable, slicing through the space between them with razor-sharp precision. Like I'm nothing more than an inconvenience in a system built for you. But let me ask you something, Officer Hayes. She let his name sit in the air for a moment, let it hang there like a verdict. If I'm nothing, then why are you afraid of me? Hayes stiffened, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had no answer. Janelle turned, letting her gaze sweep across the entire courtroom, letting the weight of her words settle into their bones. This is what justice looks like, she said, addressing everyone. Not the kind that exists only for the privileged. Not the kind that protects men like you. This is real justice. And it's coming for all of you. Calloway lurched forward, his chair scraping violently against the floor, his face twisting in outrage, but he didn't get the chance to speak before the agent beside him cut in, voice sharp and commanding. Judge Richard Calloway, you are also under arrest. Your actions have been under federal investigation for months. You've used your position to protect corrupt officers, to destroy evidence, to facilitate wrongful convictions. And now, your time is up. The air changed. Calloway froze, his breath hitching in his throat. For the first time, the reality of his own downfall crashed over him like a tidal wave, the weight of all the lives he had destroyed suddenly bearing down on his shoulders. You can't do this, he rasped, his voice weak, his face crumbling under the pressure. You have no proof, this is a setup. Janelle didn't even need to speak this time. The agent beside her lifted a thick folder and threw it onto the judge's bench, the documents spilling out like an avalanche of his sins laid bare. Bank statements, wire transfers, emails, testimonies, case files, recordings. Proof. Undeniable. Irrefutable. Overwhelming. Calloway's knees buckled, his fingers gripping the desk for support. No, he whispered, as if saying it out loud could somehow undo everything, as if his words could bend reality back into his favor. No, this can't, take them. The agents moved in, and suddenly the roles reversed completely. The same officers who had once cuffed Janelle, who had dragged her into this courtroom with smug superiority, were now forced to turn around, place their hands behind their backs, and submit to the same fate they had inflicted on so many others. The cold click of handcuffs echoed through the space, each snap of metal against wrists a sound of justice finally being served. Hayes thrashed, cursing, screaming at anyone who would listen, but it was useless. Turner begged, his voice breaking as the weight of reality finally crashed down on him. Gallagher, for once, said nothing at all, his expression hollow, his silence an admission of guilt deeper than any words he could have spoken. And Calloway? He collapsed into his chair, his face ghost white, his mind unable to comprehend a world in which he was no longer in control. As they were led away, the courtroom exploded into motion. Reporters fought to capture every moment, every face, every detail. The murmurs of the crowd turned into a roar, a collective sound of shock, of victory, of long-awaited justice. Janelle stood in the center of it all, unmoved, unshaken, victorious. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. Because the real question wasn't whether they had fallen. It was how far they would fall. The courtroom was a battlefield now, but Janelle had already won. The balance of power had shifted so suddenly, so violently, that the very foundation of the space seemed to shake under the weight of exposed corruption, shattered arrogance, and long overdue justice. The very men who had strutted in with unchecked authority, believing themselves untouchable, were now reduced to nothing more than criminals awaiting their fate. Hayes fought the cuffs, his face red with fury, veins bulging against his temple as his mind scrambled for some way out, some loophole, some trick that could save him from what was coming. He turned to Calloway, desperate, his voice sharp with panic, the arrogance from before now entirely replaced with fear. Do something. You're the goddamn judge. You can overrule this. You can, but Calloway wasn't listening. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if letting go would make the entire world collapse around him. His lips trembled, but no words came. He was drowning, sinking deeper and deeper into the realization that his reign was over. Turner let out a strangled sound, something between a sob and a gasp, his whole body shaking as he turned to Gallagher, eyes wide with disbelief, as if his partner would somehow have the answers he didn't. This isn't happening, he whispered, the words barely audible under the chaos that had erupted around them. This isn't real. This is a mistake, Gallagher, tell them, but Gallagher remained silent, his entire body rigid, his gaze fixed forward, unfocused. That was the moment Janelle knew. He had already given up. Hayes, however, was still fighting, still clawing for an escape. He turned back to Janelle, his eyes burning with pure, undiluted hatred, the kind of hatred that came from a man who had built his entire identity on power, only to see it ripped from his hands in an instant. You think this means anything? His voice shook, not with fear, but with something darker, something far more bitter. You think putting us in cuffs changes the system? You think this is over? Janelle finally met his gaze, and for the first time since this all began, she smiled. Not out of joy. Not out of victory. But out of something deeper, something colder. You still don't get it, do you? She took a slow, deliberate step forward, letting the weight of every moment, every injustice, every year of suffering under men like him sink into the space between them. This was never about you. You were just the symptom of a disease that's finally being exposed. Hayes bared his teeth like a cornered animal. You're delusional. Janelle tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Am I? She gestured toward the rows of spectators, toward the journalists frantically typing into their devices, toward the murmuring crowds outside the courtroom whose voices had become a deafening roar of change. Take a good look, Hayes. This isn't just about your arrest. This is about every case you ever touched, every innocent life you destroyed, every person you thought would stay silent forever. And guess what? She leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice to something only he could hear, letting the weight of the moment crush him from the inside out. They're not silent anymore. Hayes flinched. For the first time since this had started, he flinched. The moment stretched between them, thick with the irreversible shift in power. Then Calloway snapped. No, he choked, the denial tearing from his throat, his hands slamming against the bench as if he could physically stop the inevitable from happening. His face contorted, eyes darting wildly between the agents, the officers, the documents scattered across his desk, his own sins laid bare before him. This isn't, you don't understand, this is all wrong. His voice cracked, desperate, frantic. I did what I had to do. You think this job is easy? You think I had a choice? Janelle turned to him, her expression unreadable. You always had a choice, Judge. You just chose yourself. Calloway's breath hitched. The words hit like a final, fatal blow. Because he knew. He knew. All these years, all the people he had sentenced, all the lives he had destroyed, he had done it because it benefited him, because it secured his place in a system that rewarded men like him for stepping on the necks of people like her. He had told himself it wasn't personal, that it was just the way things were. But now. Now it was personal. Now, the system had come for him. The sound of his own cuffs clicking shut echoed like a death sentence, his arms wrenched behind his back by hands that once trembled in his courtroom. And for the first time in his life, he had no power, no gavel to slam, no verdict to dictate. Hayes, still thrashing against his own cuffs, hissed through his teeth. You're going to regret this. You're going to wish you never. Janelle exhaled sharply, cutting him off before he could finish the threat that held no power anymore. She turned to the lead agent, the man now in control of this entire operation, the one who had made this possible. Get them out of my sight. The command was met with immediate action. One by one, the men who had ruled this courtroom, who had twisted the law into their own personal weapon, were dragged toward the doors, their protests drowned beneath the cheers and camera flashes that followed. Hayes still fought, Turner sobbed, Gallagher remained eerily silent, and Calloway simply stared ahead, his eyes hollow, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. And just like that, they were gone. The room was still buzzing with energy, with whispers of disbelief, with the realization that history had just unfolded before their eyes. But Janelle? Janelle was steady. She didn't soak in the victory, didn't revel in the downfall of men who had once tried to bury her. Instead, she turned. Stepped forward. And took her rightful place behind the bench. She ran her fingers over the wood, the same wood Calloway had gripped in desperation, the same wood that had once been a symbol of corruption and oppression. But now, it was something else. It was hers. And for the first time, justice didn't belong to them. It belonged to her. To every person who had ever been silenced. To every name that had been erased. To every single soul who had ever walked into a courtroom like this one and wondered if the system would ever change. It had. And it would never be the same again. The doors had closed behind them, the sounds of their protests and desperate last words swallowed by the thick walls of the courthouse, but the weight of their downfall still lingered in the air, pressing against the very foundation of the room like an aftershock of an earthquake. What had once been a place of absolute power for men like Calloway and Hayes was now something else entirely, a crime scene, a site of long overdue reckoning, where the corrupt had finally been dragged from their thrones and reduced to nothing more than disgraced figures in handcuffs. But even as the last echo of their downfall faded, the courtroom itself felt tainted. Like it was struggling to reconcile what had just happened, as if the walls themselves had absorbed too many lies, too much injustice, too much rotted history to ever be wiped clean with a single moment of accountability. Janelle stood there, her fingers still resting against the polished wood of the judge's bench, feeling the weight of it all, the years of unchecked authority, the names of the innocent who had passed through this very room, their voices drowned beneath the gavel strike, their fates decided by men who had never seen them as anything more than numbers in a system designed to crush them. The bench had been Calloway's throne, a seat from which he had wielded his power with absolute control, ensuring that people like her never had the chance to fight back. But now, with him gone, the space he left behind felt empty, vulnerable, almost exposed. The air was thick with something that wasn't quite silence, something restless, like the room itself was trying to process the shift in power, struggling to comprehend that, for the first time in decades, true justice had been served within its walls. And yet, the moment the shock faded, the fear set in. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was there, etched into the faces of the people left behind. The clerks, the legal aides, the prosecutors and attorneys who had worked under Calloway's rule, who had operated under his authority for years, some as willing participants, others as silent enablers, were now looking at Janelle with something between uncertainty and dread. Because this wasn't just about Calloway, or Hayes, or Turner, or Gallagher. This wasn't about just one trial, one courtroom, one moment of reckoning. This was about what came next. And that terrified them. A young legal clerk, barely in his mid-20s, his pressed suit now wrinkled from the tension of the day, finally broke the suffocating silence with a voice that cracked slightly under the weight of the question hanging in the air. What happens now? His words cut through the room like a blade, dragging everyone's attention back to reality, forcing them to face what none of them had dared to consider until this moment. Janelle let the silence stretch before answering, her voice measured, deliberate, unshaken. Now. She lifted her gaze, letting it sweep over the room, making sure every single person heard her next words. Now, we deal with what's left behind. And there was a lot left behind. Marcus, standing just a few steps away, arms crossed over his chest, exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. His expression was unreadable, but the exhaustion in his eyes was undeniable, the kind of weariness that came from fighting a battle you always knew was rigged against you, from watching people like Calloway operate with impunity for years, knowing that taking down one man wouldn't fix the disease he had been a part of. Janelle, he muttered, voice low and weighted with something dangerously close to cynicism, this isn't just a few bad apples. His gaze darkened, flicking toward the empty judge's seat before returning to hers. Calloway, Hayes, Turner, they were just the ones stupid enough to get caught. You know how deep this goes. She did. She had always known. Bringing them down was necessary, but it wasn't the end of anything. The system wasn't built to correct itself, wasn't designed to hold people like Calloway accountable. It was built to survive, to adapt, to shift just enough to make people believe change had happened while still protecting the same institutions that had upheld corruption for generations. And she could already feel it happening, the way the remaining players in the room were recalibrating, their minds working rapidly, trying to figure out where they stood in this new reality. Some were already looking for ways to distance themselves from Calloway, to paint themselves as innocent bystanders who had simply been following orders. Others, the truly dangerous ones, were calculating their next moves, trying to determine whether they could still manipulate this system to their advantage. This was the real battle. Not taking Calloway down. What came next? A sudden, clipped voice cut through the growing tension. "Chief Carter." Janelle turned, her posture instinctively straightening at the sound of her title, even though she had spent years training herself not to let it dictate who she was. One of the lead federal agents, the man who had spearheaded the arrests, was watching her with the kind of unreadable expression that told her this wasn't over. His stance was professional, controlled, but there was something in his eyes, something he wasn't saying yet. "You need to come with us," he said. She didn't move immediately. Didn't answer. There was something in his tone, in the way his shoulders tensed slightly, in the way he was careful with his words. This wasn't just about processing paperwork or handling the aftermath of what had just happened. There was something else. Something bigger. She held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking, her voice quiet, but steady. "Why?" The agent hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Enough for her to see that whatever this was, it was bigger than even she had expected. His jaw tightened slightly before he finally spoke again, his voice lower this time, quieter, like he didn't want the wrong people to overhear. "Because this case, it's not just about what happened in this courtroom. There's more. A lot more." He exhaled, as if he was choosing his words carefully, deciding how much to reveal. "We need to talk." Janelle felt it then. The shift. The kind that settled deep in your bones before your mind even fully caught up, the kind that told you something was coming, something that would change everything. She had thought this was the end, that Calloway and his officers had been the rot at the heart of this case. But if the agent was right, if there was more. She turned to Marcus, and without needing to say a word, he understood. He gave her a small nod, almost imperceptible, but full of meaning. This wasn't just about one courtroom anymore. This was about all of them. Janelle turned back to the agent. She squared her shoulders. And she stepped forward. "Let's talk." She walked past the stunned faces, past the lingering whispers, past the remnants of a system that had finally started to crack. This wasn't the end. Not even close. Because if there was more, then justice was just getting started. The air in the courthouse still held the echoes of what had just transpired, the weight of justice finally shifting in a way no one had anticipated. But outside, beyond those thick marble walls, the world was already moving. Janelle walked with steady, deliberate steps, her pulse even, her mind racing. The federal agent led the way, his posture rigid, his silence heavy with implications yet to be spoken aloud. The halls, once filled with an unshakable routine of power moving in predictable patterns, now felt different, as if the very foundation had been rattled. People were whispering, watching, some avoiding eye contact, others standing frozen in disbelief. Everything had changed. Marcus caught up beside her, his presence solid, his energy different now, not just relieved that Calloway and his officers had been exposed, but aware that the fight wasn't over yet. He didn't have to say it out loud. They both knew. This was bigger than what had just happened in that courtroom. This wasn't about just one man, or 3 officers, or a few falsified reports. This was about the entire structure they had been up against for years. And if there was more, if this case went deeper than even they had suspected, then they weren't walking toward a conclusion, they were walking straight into another battle. The agent led them down a long, sterile corridor, his pace unwavering, as if every second wasted was a risk. Janelle studied his body language carefully, the way his jaw clenched, the tension in his shoulders. This wasn't just about making an arrest. Whatever they were about to hear, it was something that had shaken even the people who worked inside the system itself. When they reached a secured conference room, the agent swiped his keycard and pushed the door open without a word. Inside, a small team was already waiting, higher-ups, men and women in dark suits, their expressions carefully controlled, their eyes assessing her the moment she stepped inside. The atmosphere was suffocating, not from hostility, but from the sheer weight of whatever they were about to reveal. The door clicked shut behind them. Janelle didn't sit. Neither did Marcus. The agent moved to the head of the table, exhaled, then finally spoke. "We need to talk about what happens next." Janelle folded her arms, studying his face. "That depends. How much are you actually willing to tell me?" A beat of silence. A flicker of hesitation in his expression. Then, he sighed, reaching into a file on the table and pulling out a thick stack of documents. He spread them out, one by one, revealing dozens of names, case numbers, photographs, reports, layers of corruption far beyond what they had just exposed in that courtroom. Marcus let out a sharp breath, his fingers tightening at his sides. "Jesus," he muttered. Janelle scanned the documents, her mind processing the scope of it, the scale, the sheer number of people who had been wronged by the same system she had fought against her entire life. These weren't just random cases. These were patterns of false convictions, tampered evidence, entire communities targeted under policies designed to keep them trapped in the cycle of mass incarceration. And it all led back to people just like Calloway. Judges. Officers. Prosecutors. Entire departments. She lifted her eyes, locking onto the agent. "How long have you known?" He didn't flinch, but he also didn't answer right away. His silence was the only confirmation she needed. Her voice was quieter when she spoke again, but no less sharp. "How long?" His jaw tightened. "Too long." Marcus let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "And yet, it took Calloway going down for you to finally decide to act." One of the suits shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple." Janelle turned to them, her expression unreadable. "It never is it?" The weight of her words settled into the room, thick, unshakable. They all knew the truth. The system didn't break overnight. It was designed this way. And the only reason they were finally sitting here, finally acknowledging the rot they had ignored for so long, was because they had no choice anymore. The agent straightened, looking directly at Janelle now. "We need your help." A flicker of something cold passed through her, something dangerously close to amusement. "You need my help. You're the only person who can make this public without it getting buried." His tone was urgent, raw, the words carrying the weight of something much bigger than even what they had just uncovered. Calloway was just the beginning. If we move too fast, if we push too hard without a solid case, the entire thing collapses. They'll bury it. But if you, Janelle held up a hand, stopping him. "I know how this works." Marcus stepped forward now, his voice cutting through the tension. "If she does this, it's not just her name on the line. It's her life." The agent's expression darkened. "I know." Janelle studied him carefully. "And what about you?" His jaw clenched. "What about me? If I do this, if I step into this and blow it wide open, what happens when they come after me? When they decide I'm the problem?" She tilted her head, eyes unblinking. "Will you stand by me, or will you let them erase me, the way they've erased everyone else who's tried to fight back?" The question hung there, thick, suffocating. Then, finally, he answered. "I'll stand by you." Something in his voice told her that, despite everything, despite the corruption and the failures of the system, despite all the mistakes that had led them to this point, he meant it. And that was all she needed. Janelle exhaled slowly, then nodded once. "Then let's get to work." Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if they thought taking down Calloway was the final blow, if they thought they could just clean up the mess and move on like nothing had happened, they were about to learn the hard way that justice wasn't done yet. The weight of it all settled over the room like a storm cloud, thick, inescapable. The documents on the table, the names written in black ink, the cases buried beneath years of silence, it was more than just evidence. It was a reckoning waiting to happen. Janelle stood still, absorbing it all, feeling the pull of something much bigger than herself, something that stretched far beyond Calloway, beyond Hayes, beyond the walls of that courtroom where justice had finally struck. This was the entire system laid bare, the raw, ugly truth no one wanted to admit. Marcus rubbed his temples, his exhale sharp, weary. "This is too big to handle quietly," he muttered, shaking his head, his eyes scanning the papers, flipping through case after case after case, each one heavier than the last. "If we go public with this, if we bring this to the surface, do you have any idea what kind of war we're walking into?" He turned to Janelle now, searching her face for doubt, hesitation, but there was none. The agent at the head of the table leaned forward, his fingers pressed together, his own expression unreadable, but Janelle could see the weight of it pressing into his shoulders. "We're not asking you to take this on alone," he said finally, but his voice carried an edge, a caution, because they both knew that wasn't true. "We have people who are willing to move on this, people inside the bureau, people who have been waiting for something big enough to justify breaking the silence." He gestured toward the files, toward the sheer magnitude of what had just landed in their hands. This is big enough." Janelle glanced down at the names again, the faces of those who had suffered, those who had been buried under false convictions, those who had lost years, decades, lifetimes because of a system that never intended to protect them. She thought of the people still behind bars, the families still fighting for justice, the countless voices that had never been heard. She couldn't look away. She lifted her gaze. If this is big enough, then why hasn't anyone done anything before now? The agent's jaw tightened. Because before now, no one had proof that could hold up in court. Before now, no one had enough momentum to bring them all down at once. Before now, no one had the power to stand against them. He met her eyes with something fierce, something dangerously close to desperation. "But you do." A silence stretched across the room, heavy and unspoken. Marcus exhaled through his nose, then let out a bitter laugh, the kind that carried more exhaustion than amusement. "You realize what you're asking her to do, right?" He looked at the agent, at the people in suits who had likely spent their entire careers sitting on information like this, waiting for the right time to act, waiting for the perfect conditions while people suffered under their silence. "You want her to be the face of this. The one they come after when it all blows up." The agent didn't deny it. Janelle knew exactly what they were asking of her. She had spent her entire career fighting for justice, fighting to dismantle the structures that had worked against people like her for generations, fighting to carve out a space where the law actually meant something. And now, after everything, after Calloway, after Hayes, after all the battles that had nearly broken her but never had, they wanted her to take the fight to a level no one had ever dared to reach. She felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her, the enormity of what it meant. Then, finally, she exhaled. "Tell me everything." The agent didn't hesitate. He pulled out more documents, flipping through pages, laying out the scope of it all, the depth of the corruption, the names of people who had been operating behind the scenes for years, pulling the strings, making sure the system worked exactly as it was designed to. He talked about judges, officers, prosecutors, politicians, an entire web of power that had built itself on injustice, one conviction at a time. And the deeper Janelle listened, the more she realized that this wasn't just about the courtroom anymore. This was about undoing something that had existed for centuries. Marcus listened in silence, his arms crossed, his jaw locked tight. When the agent finally finished, when the last document had been laid bare, he let out a slow, measured breath. "You do realize that if we do this, if we take this to the public, there's no walking it back." He turned to Janelle, his expression unreadable. "You do this, and you're not just going after bad cops and corrupt judges anymore. You're going after the system itself. Janelle didn't flinch. I know. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then shook his head, almost like he couldn't believe they had ended up here. And here I thought taking down Calloway was the hard part. The agent leaned forward. We have a chance to change everything. But we need you. Janelle let the words settle, let the weight of them press into her bones, let herself feel every inch of the fight that was still ahead. Then, finally, she nodded. Then let's burn it all down. The room fell silent. And just like that, justice had only just begun. The storm that had started in that courtroom did not end with Calloway in cuffs. It spread, unraveling like a thread pulled too tight, exposing every hidden corruption, every backdoor deal, every carefully orchestrated cover-up that had allowed men like him to thrive for years. The system had spent decades protecting itself, ensuring that the guilty never faced consequences. But this time, there was no burying the truth. It started with the arrests. Calloway, Hayes, Turner, and Gallagher were paraded in front of the cameras, their downfall broadcasted across the country. The headlines were brutal. A judge who had built his career on upholding the law now found himself on the other side of it. Officers who had once walked free despite their crimes were now the ones being processed, fingerprinted, forced into jumpsuits like the countless people they had wrongfully condemned. It was a spectacle the public devoured, a long-awaited moment of justice, but for Janelle, it was never just about them. They were only the beginning. With the weight of the federal investigation pressing down, the system started to eat itself alive. Those who had stood beside Calloway, other judges, prosecutors, high-ranking officers, scrambled to save themselves, some cutting deals, others trying to erase their tracks before it was too late. Some resigned, trying to disappear before the storm reached their doorstep. Others weren't as lucky. One by one, they fell, and the deeper the investigation went, the more rot it uncovered. People who had spent their entire careers believing they were untouchable now found themselves exactly where they had put so many others, behind bars. For Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He had spent years fighting a system that had been designed to break people like him, knowing that every battle was an uphill one, that justice was a rare thing when the enemy wrote the rules. Seeing Calloway fall, seeing the dominoes that followed, it was vindication, but it also came with the heavy realization that for every Calloway exposed, there were 10 more waiting in the shadows. The system wasn't gone. It was wounded, bleeding, but it would try to rebuild itself, to adapt, to survive. And that meant the fight wasn't over. Hayes, stripped of his badge, his rank, his false sense of superiority, didn't take it well. He had built his identity on power, on the idea that he was the one who made the rules, the one who decided who suffered and who walked free. But now, he was the one locked in a cage, and reality hit him like a freight train. The same inmates he had helped imprison, the same lives he had ruined without hesitation, they were waiting for him. It didn't take long before he learned the hard way what it felt like to be on the other side of the system he had once manipulated. Turner, terrified and desperate, tried to turn on everyone he had ever worked with, offering up names, trying to buy his way into leniency. But the truth was, there was no way out for him. His crimes weren't just paper trails, they were real lives destroyed, and the courts weren't interested in saving him the way he had once expected. He was sentenced swiftly, without mercy, his pleas falling on deaf ears. Gallagher, the quiet one, the one who had always looked away instead of speaking out, crumbled under the weight of his own guilt. He wasn't like Hayes, filled with rage and delusion, nor like Turner, trying to survive by turning against his own. He simply broke. The moment he stood in court, hearing the evidence laid out, seeing the faces of the people whose lives he had ruined, he didn't fight. He didn't argue. He simply accepted his fate, knowing that he had built his own prison long before he had ever been caught. And then there was Calloway. A man who had once owned that courtroom, who had ruled it with an iron grip, who had dismissed the pleas of the innocent with barely a glance. Now, he was powerless. The gavel no longer belonged to him. The decisions were no longer his to make. The same arrogance that had once defined him shattered in the face of reality. His trial was long, brutal, public. His crimes, his abuses of power, his countless acts of corruption, they were dissected for the world to see. And in the end, he was left with nothing. The same legal system he had once twisted to his advantage now swallowed him whole, and for the first time in his life, he faced the one thing he had spent his career ensuring never touched him. Accountability. And Janelle? She didn't stop. Even as the dust settled, even as headlines shifted, as new cases arose, as people tried to pretend things had gone back to normal, she didn't stop. She stood before Congress, before committees, before the very institutions that had once dismissed her, and she spoke the truth they had tried to bury. She demanded reform, not just for Calloway's courtroom but for all of them, for every judge, every officer, every prosecutor who had built their power on the backs of the innocent. She fought for laws that would make it harder for people like Calloway to rise, harder for the system to protect itself from accountability. She fought for the ones who never got justice, for the ones whose names never made the headlines, for the ones who had been erased. And she won. Not everything. Not all at once. The system was still there, still wounded but not dead. But it wasn't the same anymore. Because now, people were watching. Now, they knew. The day the last ruling was handed down, the day the final sentence was given, she stood outside the courthouse, looking up at the building that had once tried to crush her, the same building where she had flipped the script. Marcus stood beside her, arms crossed, the weight of everything they had fought for settling between them. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't know whether to call this a win or just another battle in a war that never really ends. Janelle didn't hesitate. It's both. She turned to him, the fire still in her eyes, the same fire that had carried her through every injustice, every fight, every moment where the system had tried to silence her. But at least now, she said, voice steady, unshaken, unbreakable, they know we're not afraid to fight back. She walked away from the courthouse that day, not in defeat, not as someone who had barely survived, but as someone who had changed the course of history. And the system? It would never be the same again. Now, let me ask you something. How many times have you seen people like Calloway walk free? How many times have you watched corruption go unpunished, seen the guilty shield themselves behind power, while the innocent suffer under laws that were never meant to protect them? How many stories just like this one have played out in real life, except without justice, without consequences, without change? But here's the truth. The system doesn't break itself. It has to be broken. By people who refuse to stay silent. By those who stand up, even when the odds are against them. By those who know that justice isn't about waiting, it's about fighting for it. So tell me, after hearing this story, what do you think? What would you have done? And more importantly, what are you going to do now that you know how deep the truth goes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, *** stories of justice, of power, of truth that refuses to stay buried, ***, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on notifications. Because trust me, this was just the beginning.